Swayam Prabha. Digital India. Educated India.
Hello everyone, this is Dr. Bhanupriya Rohila from Mohanlal Sukhadia University. This lecture is a part of the third phase of the DTH Swayam Prabha program for the subject English Literature offered to the undergraduate students. This series of lectures deals with the topics from the paper British Romantic Literature run by Utkal University for semester 3 of BA English Honours. The syllabus of the paper is based on the UGC CBCS syllabus of the paper with the same nomenclature. In today's lecture, we are going to discuss the poem Kubla Khan by Samuel Taylor Coleridge. Kubla Khan, which is also known as a vision in a dream, a fragment. This romantic poem is an example of pure poetic imagination. Now, before we start with the text of the poem, let's discuss the background of both the poet and the poem. Coleridge was a poet, a critic, an essayist, and a political thinker. Apart from his poetry, he is famous for his essays and lectures on various serious subjects. In literature, besides for his prose treatises, he is known for his poetic fantasy and his romanticism full of unusual fancies and mysterious elements. This poem perfectly exemplifies all this. He was very much influenced with the genre of Gothic, and the poems like Rime of the Ancient Mariner, Kubla Khan and Christabel have certain elements of this genre. The poem Kubla Khan is known to be a dream poem. The poem was written in 1797 and got published in 1816. In the preface of the poem, it is stated that Coleridge was in a bad health and therefore he had a pastoral retreat in 1797. Therefore, he was staying in a lonely farmhouse between the two small coastal villages, Porlock and Linton in England. For his illness, he was prescribed opium as an anodyne, which made him sleep one day. Before he dozed off, he was reading a travel book titled Purchas His Pilgrims. The book was written by Samuel Purchas, who was a clergyman and who wrote this travel book in the early 17th century. The lines he read just before falling asleep were, "In Xanadu did Kublai Khan build a stately palace. encompassing 16 miles of plain ground with a wall wherein are fertile meadows, pleasant springs, delightful streams, and all sorts of beasts of chase and game, and in the midst thereof a sumptuous house of pleasure. So, this was the line that he read before falling asleep, and thus he dreamt of the same Kublai Khan in his sleep, from which he woke up after 3 hours and had quite a vivid image alive in his mind that made him confident of writing at least 200 to 300 lines of this poem. And thus he started writing very hurriedly, taking his pen and a paper, but in the meantime, a visitor came from Porlock to meet him, and thus Coleridge got engaged with him for about an hour. After that fellow left, Coleridge thought of resuming writing his poem again, but unfortunately, the vision that he remembered quite distinctly now had weakened, and with the remaining vague recollections, he could write only a few lines and never could recall it completely. Probably, therefore, the poem is called A Vision in a Dream, a Fragment. Since he could not complete what he saw in the dream, and thereby this poem is an unfinished poem. So the poem is basically inspired by the travel book Perchas His Pilgrims, wherein he talked about Kubla Khan or Kublai Khan and his palace in Xanadu. So now, who was Kubla Khan? Kublai Khan was the grandson of Genghis Khan, and he was a Mongol emperor who founded the Yuan dynasty in the 13th century China. Shangru was his summer capital. It is the same place which is known as Xanadu here. It was a splendid, mysterious palace which Kubla Khan had made in Xanadu, and the same has been portrayed in several works of arts and literature. Coleridge in this poem has used it to signify grandeur and magnitude, and also the exotic elements of it. So this was the background of the poem, and now let's move on to the text of the poem. The text of the poem is divided into 3 verse paragraphs. And the first part, or the first verse paragraph, reads as: In Xanadu did Kubla Khan a stately pleasure dome decree, where Alph, the sacred river, ran through caverns measureless to man, down to a sunless sea. So the poem starts with the character Kubla Khan. And Kubla Khan, as we have discussed above, was a Mongol emperor and the founder of the Yuan dynasty. And in his vision, Coleridge saw that the powerful emperor ordered to construct a stately, that is royal or splendid or lavish pleasure dome. That is a palace or some domed building for pleasure in a mythical place called Xanadu, which is supposedly his capital city too. Xanadu is the city Shangru, which was the capital city of the Chinese emperor Kubla Khan in summers. Here in the poem, now Coleridge describes what is there in the city. The city of Xanadu was the place where the sacred river Alph ran. It is the same Alpheus river which has been portrayed by the poet Virgil in his book Aeneid. The river is found in Greece, But Coleridge has changed the location here as Mongolian China. The myth of the river says that Alpheus was a river god who pursued the nymph Arethusa, who fled to the island of Ortygia in Sicily and turned into a fountain. The myth holds that the Alpheus River goes underground in the Peloponnese and resurfaces in Sicily. And here we can visualize the sacred river Alph running through dark caverns, that is, caves. They are so dark that nobody can measure their depth. And then the river goes down to a sunless sea, which means it disappears somewhere which seems like the sun cannot penetrate the caves and the place where it falls down to or mixes with the sea. So it is also said that the river runs through the Arcadian mountains and caves, and after flowing under the sea, it reappears at some distance, which is Sicily as per the myth. Thus, we can see that in the very first lines of the poem, the poet takes us to a very unusual and fascinating place called Xanadu, which is holy as well as mysterious. Holy because of the river and mysterious because human beings are so ignorant of how it originates and where the river goes down. Then he says in the next few lines, so twice 5 miles of fertile ground with walls and towers were girdled round, and there were gardens bright with sinuous rills, where blossomed many an incense-bearing tree, and here were forests ancient as the hills, enfolding sunny spots of greenery. This describes what goes on subsequently in the vision. The pleasure dome is surrounded with a large fertile ground of twice 5 miles, that is 10 miles. And this land has walls and towers around it like a girdle. What is a girdle? So girdle is a waistband. So like this, it surrounds it. There are beautiful gardens alongside the sinuous rills. Sinuous means meandering or winding. As we see the sine waves in mathematics, and rills are the streamlets or small streams where so many trees are there full of fragrant blossoms or sweet smelling flowers. And besides these gardens, there are forests, that is thick clusters of trees which are as old as the hills around are. And those forests have some clearings within where the green land shines with the sun, or we can say that the sun can penetrate amidst those clusters. So here the poet gives a very vivid and picturesque description of the landscape. There are gardens, streams, forests, hills, trees, flowers, and the presence of the sun, which looks as if the poet has brought the whole nature onto one canvas. The brightness of the gardens and the spots of greenery give a very contrasting image with the sunless sea and the deep caves. Now, the second stanza of the poem begins here. But, oh, that deep romantic chasm which slanted down the green hill athwart a cedarn cover, a savage place, as holy and enchanted as ever beneath a waning moon was haunted by woman wailing for her demon lover. So here he again begins by giving a description of this exotic place. He is astonished to see the beauty of the place and the deep and impressive and unrealistic chasm, which means a gap or a rift that creates a valley, which is slanting down the green hill. And the green hill is completely covered with cedar trees. One can virtually visualize those trees and the hills and the rift slanting down. Further, he also calls it a savage or a wild place. So, besides being romantic and quite unusual, he says it is as holy and enchanted. He finds it a sacred as well as a mysterious place. The poet is so enthralled and captured by this enchanted place that he compares it with a place which is haunted by a woman crying for her demon lover underneath the waning moon or the fading moon, which is crescent shaped. We can see that on one hand, the poet compares it with a holy place, and on the other hand, he says that the woman is crying for her demon lover. So, demon is a contrast with the holiness. This whole stanza brings the supernatural, the mysterious, and the wild together into the mind. It also explains how skillfully Coleridge could turn the natural landscape into a haunted and mysterious yet enrapturing place. The last line of this piece, that is by woman wailing for her demon lover, has also been quoted by Lord Byron in his work Heaven and Earth. This is just a cross reference and has nothing much to do with the interpretation of the poem or the text. Now, let's move on to the next lines. He further says, and from this chasm, with ceaseless turmoil seething, as if this earth in fast thick pants were breathing, a mighty fountain momently was forced, amid whose swift half-intermitted burst huge fragments vaulted like rebounding hail, or chaffy grain beneath the thrasher's flail. And mid these dancing rocks at once and ever, it flung up momently the sacred river. So here we have again the beautiful word picture that he has drawn here in these lines. He says, and from that chasm or the rift, with its ceaseless turmoil seething, that is to say, there is a never-ending turmoil that keeps boiling. The underground is always churning. So from that chasm, with a constantly running agitation underground, a powerful fountain of water erupts, as if the earth is breathing heavily. And amid that burst of water, which is swift but quite intermittent or quite irregular, there come huge pieces of rock or the mountain hurtling as the hailstones bounce or like the grain pieces bounce underneath the thrasher's flail. So thrasher is the one who harvests or separates the grains from the husk by beating it. And a flail is a thrashing tool. So here it means that the force of water is intermittent but so powerful that the rock pieces bounce like rebounding hail or like the chaffy grain beneath the thrasher's flail. And then amid these fragments, which look as if dancing, the fountain intermittently keeps tossing in the air. In these lines, we can see the deep chasm and the unrest going underneath the ground, and on the other hand, we see the high pleasure dome with beautiful and orderly surroundings. Moving on, the poet writes, 5 miles, meandering with a mazy motion through wood and dale, the sacred river ran. Then reached the seas, the caverns measureless to man, and sank in tumult to a lifeless ocean. And amid this tumult, Kubla heard from far ancestral voices prophesying war. That is, for around 5 miles, the sacred river Alf runs in a winding motion through the forest and valleys. Then, through the measureless caves, it sinks into the lifeless ocean that we have discussed already. One can visualize here the boisterous water of the river sinking into the sea, which is still, which is lifeless. Probably because we cannot see where it sinks into the ocean, as he said in the first stanza of the poem. That's why he calls it lifeless. And amid the boisterous and tumultuous water, Kubla Khan hears something. Now, what does he hear? He hears some ancestral voices, that is, the voices of the ones who have died. And the voices are coming from a distance. And they make a prophecy. The voices make a prophecy about an imminent war there. The next line says, the shadow of the dome of pleasure floated midway on the waves, where was heard the mingled measure from the fountain and the caves. It was a miracle of rare device, a sunny pleasure dome with caves of ice. So, the shadow of the pleasure dome is seen floating on the waves. So the reflection is seen on the waves of water of the Alf River, and it is seen at the place where one can hear the mingled measure. That is, the mingling of the boisterous water of fountain rumbling in the deep caves, which is heard here. And further, he calls the pleasure dome a rare device and miraculous. The miracle lies in the fact that it's a sunny pleasure dome with caves of ice. So we can see that this is a paradoxical description where one can see the sun and the caves of ice together, and also the reflection of the dome on the flowing water. But at the same time, this reflects how Coleridge always used his rich imagination in such a lyrical and poetic language. The sensual imagery of the visual and the auditory is so well deployed here. So we can see that reflections don't come on the moving water, but here they are, and the sun melts ice, but we can see that they exist together here. Now comes the third or the last stanza of the poem, or the verse paragraph, that reads as, a damsel with a dulcimer in a vision once I saw. It was an Abyssinian maid, and on her dulcimer she played, singing of Mount Abora. Could I revive within me her symphony and song, to such a deep delight it would win me. And the next few lines we'll read later on. So here, in this stanza, now Coleridge introduces us with another vision and talks about a damsel, that is a dame or a beautiful woman, playing on a dulcimer. So dulcimer is a stringed musical instrument which she is playing here. So here he talks about this woman playing dulcimer whom he saw in a vision. She was an Abyssinian maid. So Abyssinia is a place in northern Ethiopia. The woman sings songs of Mount Abora. Now this Mount Abora, as some critics claim, is the Mount Amara, which has been described by Milton in Paradise Lost, since Mount Amara is a real place, whereas the name Mount Abora is a mythic place or a fictitious place. However, all the characteristics that Coleridge has described of Mount Abora have close similarity with Mount Amara, which is said to be a part of Abyssinia. So we can say that the lady is singing of her land and the mountain there. In next lines, he says that with music loud and long, I would build that dome in air, that sunny dome, those caves of ice, and all who heard should see them there, and all should cry, beware, beware. His flashing eyes, his floating hair, weave a circle round him thrice, and close your eyes with holy dread, for he on honey dew hath fed and drunk the milk of paradise. So these are the last lines of this poem, and Coleridge here describes that the Abyssinian maid on her dulcimer sings. He draws a parallel between the pleasure dome and the loud and long music of the damsel, and he feels that if he could revive that song and music in his imagination, it would enable him to build the pleasure dome on air with all its mystic magic of paradoxes like the sunny dome and the caves of ice. All who have heard of the dome of Kubla Khan should see that palace there, and all onlookers must be filled with a supernatural awe and must have a feeling of caution. As he says, all should cry, beware, beware. Then he goes on to describe his own persona as the creator of the dome and its magic through the power of intense music and its pitch, and makes us visualize his own image in that form of creator with flashing eyes and floating hair as a passionately indulged believer. The voice of the onlooker says to weave a circle round the creator thrice and pray the creator in the holy dread, since in the capacity of the creator he possesses divine powers. Here we have threefold images of the power of creation. First, Kubla Khan as the creator of the dome, then the Abyssinian maid with her dulcimer and song, and finally the poet with both the elements and his own passion. The poem ends with the description of the creator who has fed on the honeydew and drunk the milk of paradise. It again reinforces the presence of the divine element in the poet. So this was the text of the poem. Now let's summarize it. To summarize, we can say that the poem Kubla Khan is the poem which reflects the imaginative power of the poet. The exotic land of which some parts exist and some are fictitious, the mystery and enchantment of the area surrounding the pleasure dome that altogether looks like a paradise on earth are vividly portrayed here in the poem. The poem is, although a fragment of a dream which Coleridge failed to recall completely, but the poetic attributes of this composition make this a poem of pure imagination and is a manifestation of Coleridge's art of creativity. Because of its origin from a dream, the poem has been interpreted from a psychological perspective as well by several scholars. And the dream has been interpreted as a metaphor of human consciousness. The dark caverns and the sunless sea have been treated as the unconscious or the subconscious mind of the human being, and the bright and sunny aspects of nature are the symbols of the conscious and enlightened mind. The mysterious and haunted land reflect the fear, doubts, and ignorance of the mind. The poem is rich in visual imagery. The 3 verse paragraphs have varying number of lines with varying meters used in them. This unfinished poem is considered among the masterpieces of literature and is said to be the poem of human genius and a symbol of creative process, since it is a product of both memory and imagination. So this was all about the poem. I hope you followed it completely. Thank you.